Hey, welcome to the podcast. I'm Joel, here with Dad, as always.
And I'm Rick, and we're glad you're here with us today.
Yeah.
What do you want to talk about? What's up?
Hey, I just got back from a conference, and I met a couple of our listeners.
Oh, really?
And they weren't the ones I thought were our listeners. So I think we're up to maybe 8 or 9 listeners at this point.
I wonder if those original 2 have still listening. I don't know.
No, just kidding. Actually, I'm amazed at the numbers we see. We actually keep ticking up on the numbers of people watching. We're still trying to build that YouTube presence.
Yeah.
It's a hard nut to crack. So if maybe we're just not made for TV. We got a face for radio.
We do have a face for radio, that's for sure.
So if you're interested in watching it on YouTube, it is available on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com/Joel Malm. And but it seems like more people are into audio. So anyway.
Yeah. Well, even on YouTube, sometimes you just play it while you're doing something else.
Yeah, but at least it would show numbers, right?
That's true. That's what we need is numbers, right?
We need numbers. I need numbers.
Numbers matter. Jesus counted the 100 sheep. So how do you know there's 100 sheep? He had to count them.
Right on. All right. So here's what I've got for today. When the first time I realized this about myself, it was when I was just starting college, when most of my friends were graduating. And I feel like I've always kind of been behind the curve. My high school wanted me to go to college, but I just didn't, right? It took me about 3 years before I finally got into college, 3 or 4 years, which now looking back, I'm like 3 or 4 years, whatever.
Yeah.
But when you're young, it feels like you're behind or something. Yeah. My best friend, Wes, all 3 of his kids are in college. I've got a kid in 4th grade. So he got married way before me, had kids way before me, and basically all of my friends did that. And I've kind of noticed throughout my life that I guess I'm what you would call a late bloomer. I do things behind the curve of what most people do, and they are kind of, if I'm comparing my life to them, which is unwise, as Apostle Paul says, when they compare them, or was it James that says when they compare themselves to themselves, they're unwise. Yeah, it's Paul, right? So if I'm comparing my life, I look at my life and I go, I'm behind. I've always been kind of late to come do the things everybody else does, and I don't know why that is. I don't know if that's my resistant, disagreeable personality. But I want to talk about that idea of late bloomers because I'm the older I get. First of all, the older I get, the less I'm worried about time schedules and what should have been at a certain time, and the more I'm worried about I want to make sure I'm fulfilling my destiny. But I think it's a challenge because a lot of times we look around and there's this pattern for what life should be, and I think there's actually some profound truth in the need for these patterns. Right, the reason the patterns have been set up, you find a spouse, you get a career, you have kids, this order, we've kind of thrown all that out the door. But there's also this idea of we all have a unique calling in our life. So I want to talk about this idea of late bloomers. What do how do you know if you're a late bloomer? I think everybody kind of already knows they are. And maybe it's a conversation on comparison. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I don't know. You just remind me of a Cat Stevens song,
What's that?
The father and son thinks, find a girl, settle down. If you want, you can marry. Look at me. I am old, but I'm happy. That's my generation, okay?
Anyway. Cat Stevens. All right.
He's Mufasa something. I know Mufasa's the lion. I don't know. I can't remember what his name is.
He changed his name,
he's
right?
Some Muhammad, some Muslim name. Yeah. Anyway, it's not Mufasa. That's the lion. But anyhow, I remember that conversation. I remember a conversation we had when you were talking about that. Man, I just feel like I'm falling behind. And I know it was early on. I didn't remember if it was when you were starting college or before. But I remember telling you, life is not a race, man. It's not like see who can get to the end and die first, It's not a race. And there are certain patterns like that do follow. But I remember I used to be an early adopter. And when something would come out, I was really excited about it and I would jump in on it. And I got burned a few times and I thought, you know what? I'm going to wait until the 2nd or 3rd rendition of this thing, and kind of see how it goes. And like in a military situation, it's the point guy, the one who busts through the door first that gets shot.
Yeah.
So there's something to be said for not being the lead dog, all the time. Now the lead dog's view,
Yeah, I've always heard it. The first guy through the wall is the bloodiest because he took all the blows getting through the wall.
Well,
but
that's true too. Yeah. And I mean, there's the other side of that. If you're not the lead dog, the view never changes. But it's that lead guy that always gets shot up and burst up. So there's something to be said for not being an early adopter. However, I think the big key here is that you have to realize it is not a race. And I think what I shared with you at the time was, when you think about it, Moses, he didn't even start. I mean, his first 80 years of his life, for all practical purposes, were wasted. I mean, we know they weren't, because he was learning the ways of the desert. God was still working through him and everything and preparing him to do this great thing. But his life didn't even start, really, his ministry. And he's one of the greats. I mean, probably the greatest, maybe next to Abraham, in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. He's one of the greatest men God used. They refer back to him all the time, like they do to Abraham. But he didn't even start till he was 80 years old. And so what I'm saying is, you don't have to wait till you're 80. What I'm saying, though, is that God has a timeline for each of our lives. Paul talks about, I told you it's not a race. Well, Paul talked about, I finished the race. But it's not a race against other people.
That's an important thing, because we're always comparing ourselves to other people.
Exactly, and that's the problem. If we feel like I'm racing against, because he also says, I fought a good fight. Well, the fight isn't against other Christians. Neither is the race against other people. The race is finishing the course that God has laid out for you. And that's how I read that. I finished my course, the one God laid out for me. I finished it. And it might be a short course. You think of James, Peter, James, and John. That James was killed right at the start of the book of Acts. I mean, he spends 3 years with Jesus, and then he's killed right away. Never really gets to do much. And the James that we read about who wrote the book is the brother of Jesus, not that James. That James was killed right away. But his brother John lived the longest. And so was one a failure and one a success? No, God's plan for this guy was a short race, a sprint. God's plan for this guy was a marathon. God's plan for Moses was a real marathon, a lot of years, But most of those years were just preparation, just stretching and getting ready for the gun to sound so he could take off.
Yeah.
So I think we just have to keep in mind that God knows what he's doing in our life, and he has a purpose for us. And you can run ahead of him, but you're just going to have to stop and go back to this starting line and wait until his time's right for you.
You're talking about how God has, it's been preparation. One of the most inspiring books I've ever read, and I've talked about this a dozen times on the podcast, but I've never had the book available. It's this book right here. It's called Old Masters and Young Geniuses. It's by David Galenson. And if you're not on YouTube, you can't see this. So I would encourage you to go to YouTube and subscribe, where you can see what this book I'm holding up.
I don't even think you can see the book until you subscribe.
That's right. That's right.
It's a magic thing we built in.
The essence of this book, this guy's an art guy, and he basically has concluded that the pieces of work of art that we generally consider the greatest work of art were actually created by artists in their later stages of life. And he says there's two kinds of innovators. He calls them experimental and conceptual. And conceptual innovators are ones that kind of get their one hit wonder early.
Yeah.
And they come up with a new way of doing things, and they hit a new way of doing things early on. He says Raphael is one of those. But he says most of the great works of art that we really value as great works were done by the old masters. And if you look at their work, they do these spectrograph or something where you can look at their work, you see that many of the works of art that we call the greatest are built on layers of previous attempts. Like even the Mona Lisa, when you scan it, there's previous attempts, and then they paint over it and paint over it and paint over it. Back in the day, supplies were very expensive, so canvases, they would just paint over it until it's finished. And so the idea is that the works that we consider the greatest were actually built on experimentation over years and years and years. It's a very rare person that you find that their work just hits it right early on. Right. These geniuses, but even guys like Steve Jobs, I think about, he was older when he was coming up with things like the iPod and things like that. So we kind of tend to think if we don't hit our stride early on, maybe we're missing something. But really, the data seems to indicate most people hit their stride later in life. In that book, Strength to Strength, he talks about that as well, doesn't he?
Yeah. Yeah, because again, you are building upon what you've learned, And again, as you said, there's every now and then, we tend to see the exception as the norm.
Right.
And so every now and then there's somebody who just hits it out of the park once, but oftentimes they then disappear from the scene, because it takes the endurance and the continuous and the faithfulness and the just continuing hammering away. It's like, Steve Jobs became an overnight success, didn't he?
Yeah.
After years and years and years. And Elon Musk, he's an overnight success. No, these guys have been building and building and building in obscurity for years and years and years, when all of a sudden they become an overnight success.
That is so true. If you look at anybody that you're like, wow, they became an overnight success. A friend of mine's wife, just her music took off, right? And because I know what I know about success, I went to him and I was like, did y'all go through like just the most brutal season recently? He's like, yeah, that's what happened. And he's like, and then at the end of it, her music took off.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, you don't get to where you are without having gone through many, many, many challenges. And the ones that didn't have the challenges that built their character leading up to their success, you see oftentimes they crash and burn. I mean, how many great pastors you see, like they're top of their game, right? It's like they come out of nowhere seemingly. And then next thing you know, their whole ministry crashes and burns or fails.
Yeah.
And so much of the time, the character you need to sustain you in the long term is built in obscurity.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, maybe that's where being a late bloomer is a blessing, where you don't have the pressure on you. I had a friend of mine and he wrote a song early on. I think he was in his teens. The song just took off. I mean, millions and millions and millions of copies of this song. And he said it's stressful because the rest of your life you're trying to live up to that thing. Yeah. Authors that hit a book, their first book takes off, they feel like they've got to follow up with something just as great. And rarely are you able to do that. So you get to the point where you go, it becomes a burden. And so maybe the blessing of being a late bloomer is nobody's got their eye on you to see what else you're going to produce.
Yeah.
You get to kind of sneak into the side door of success.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that foundation you're talking about being built. I'm going through First Peter right now. I'm doing a series, so everything in my mind is First Peter. But he talks about the testing of your faith that is more precious than gold, and he talks about how that when the faith has been tested, it comes out pure and it's precious to God. And I realize that is exactly what, if your faith hasn't been tested, if you haven't been tested, if you haven't gone through that fire, then it is what builds a solid foundation. And that's, as you were talking, so many men, and I guess women as well, they are able to build something that outstrips the character of their foundation. And so you've got this big, tall ministry or life or reputation or whatever that's built, but with a faulty foundation. And the seeds of the destruction of any organization or any ministry or any life, the seeds of that lay in the foundation. The seeds of the destruction of that lay in the foundation. So if I've got something that's built big, but I've got a weak foundation, it's not hard for me to just hit that foundation and the whole thing comes tumbling down. And that's what happens so many times. We haven't built the foundation. And so our walk with God, our responsibility is to make the roots go deep. And then as the roots get deeper, God can take care of the expansion of how wide that ministry goes. Our responsibility is to go deep in the Lord, build good roots, and then what happens out of that, God can take care of that.
I wanted to read that verse. 1 Peter 1:7 is the one you were referring to. It's actually 6. It says, "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials."
Yeah.
Yes. "These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and you're filled with inexpressible and glorious joy." Peter, man, for being a fisherman, he's a pretty good writer later on at the end of his life. I'm working through 2 Peter right now.
Okay.
And I'm like, this dude is pretty eloquent at the end of his life, but he had to beat his head against some walls to get there.
Well, that's what I'm going to start off telling people, that it's not the disciple Peter that we all know and love who wrote that book. It was a changed man.
Yeah, it was a refined by fire Peter.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I'm looking at 2 Peter and some of his language. I'm like, this is as eloquent as Paul in many. It's almost more beautiful than Paul because Paul's so hardcore about everything.
And some of his stuff's as deep theologically, hard to understand as well, Peter, So that's what I say. It's not the disciple Peter. It's the Peter that's been through the sanctifying work of the Holy Spirit, which he refers to also in that verse. And I wondered, why do those difficulties produce praise to the glory of God the Father? And I realized it's because if our faith endures that fire, it's because our faith is in him, not in the goodies. Not in the, life's good and you become a Christian, everything's going to be wonderful, beautiful. well, awesome. If that were the case, then big deal. Everybody would be a Christian. Why not? But when your faith endures those trials and faith, and you still say, though you slay me, Lord, yet will I trust you. A quote from
Job. Yeah.
When you can say that, God, whatever goes, if it goes bad, if it goes sour, if it goes wrong, though you yourself put the knife into my heart, I'm going to trust you. Then that's the kind of praise that God is glorified by.
That almost makes you wonder too, if oftentimes God causes us to be what we would consider late bloomers, because when you get after a series of trials to a place of success, whatever that ends up being, I am convinced success is more of a direction than a destination. You enjoy the journey, right? But when you get to that place, you have something even more gratitude because you know what it took to get there. Whereas if you just have an overnight success, you do your thing. Oftentimes the people that reach the success later in their life, I think they have a lot more gratitude for it because they've been through the trial, right? Yeah.
I think the other thing about that would be, I remember a guy planting some trees one